and they are looking at doing theirs again, or at least certain parts of it. They're undergoing a process at the moment to do that because their constitution of 1937 is not fit for purpose because society changes, demands change on government. And so I would prefer to have a document which protects the rights of the individual and the responsibilities of the state without getting too hung up on policy decisions and putting them in there and making a constitution the mirror image of the government of the time that writes it. And I think that will be affected by how we choose to construct a constitution. Do we follow examples of the Irish one, where they have a mixture of politicians and selected people from the electoral roll, or do we use Icelandic kind of crowdsourced constitution, or is it left in the hands of lawyers or civil servants? I don't know. I think that might be a part of how we decide what kind of constitution we're going to have. I also think that it could be kind of a healing process. The imagining of things is perhaps something that we can unite on to work together after an independence vote, because it shouldn't be a document of the victors. It has to be very much an inclusive document. And I think if you have a document which would be filled with policy, that isn't very inclusive to the wider society. So I'd be very careful about going down that route.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. As the idea that it could be a healing process, I really quite like that idea. But Stu, what do you think?
Yeah, well, disappointingly for fans of conflict such as myself, I basically agree with everything Natalie's just said. I mean, we've been on Wings Over Scotland. We've been very, very big from the word go on sort of separating the idea of the referendum from the idea of an election. I don't think it's at all helpful. I think it's pointlessly divisive to start talking about specific policies in the context of the referendum. The referendum is about giving us the choice, giving us the chance to make choices. So those choices should be made at elections. I think there's some stuff that I do like very much. I very much like the idea of enshrining the right that everyone should have a home. I don't think, that's not going to divide anybody. Nobody's going to say people shouldn't have homes. I think you're also on safe ground to say that Scotland should be a country without nuclear weapons, because frankly we wouldn't be allowed to have nuclear weapons anyway in terms of non-proliferation treaties. So yeah, those things are are fairly safe. But anything else, I agree completely with Natalie that that would be the perfect thing in many ways to get everyone round the table again, because the way that the campaign is being conducted, particularly of course we would say by the No campaign, is so horribly divisive and ugly and nasty that if we don't have a way to sort of get around the table and learn to be friends again immediately afterwards, it could be very unpleasant indeed.
I can inject a bit of conflict into this discussion because I can kind of see both sides. Andrew talks about checks and balances. If I can just kind of quote Howard Zinn, who's a historian, some of you may know, I think he's well worth reading, but he talked about when he was at school and they were teaching him the glories of the American Constitution. There's the three branches of government, the executive, legislative, judicial, and checks and balances. If one side does something bad, it will be checked by the other side. That way, nothing bad can happen. But the problem comes if all three parts of it, the executive, judicial, and legislative, are controlled by the same people. In this case, you might call in America, they're all controlled by neoliberal people. Then what checks and balances actually exist? So I can see the value of actually having some of these rights written out in the Constitution. I can also see the value of pared down because times change. In fact, people use the American Constitution as an example very often, but it's written there, like what Natalie's saying about Ireland, it's written in there that they should rip it up and do it again every 80 years or so. And just a final point on the American Constitution that's worth remembering, it does say in there that a black person is worth 5/8 of a white person. Which is worth bearing in mind when people hold it up as this glorified document, as you often see in America. But, okay, so this is just to inject a bit of conflict into it. Can you explain to me, if one of you can take up this baton, but explain to me why, for example, it's not a good idea to put something like, I don't know, to take one off the top of my head, the fact that the minimum wage, there should be a minimum wage and it should be linked to inflation. Why would that be a bad idea or a bad thing to put in a constitution? Who's going to run with that?
A minimum wage is a particularly tricky one, I think. And certainly, if you look at constitutions in the world, you will see quite similar policies being adopted. The one I always push people towards is Brazil. Brazil includes in its vast constitution a whole range of different things, including, for example, maternity leave as well. And I think the question you asked, Michael, is a good one, because it makes us focus on this question. Most people would agree that fair trials are important, and that fair trials are probably sufficiently important that we put them in the Constitution. You think, well, surely economics are also important. Surely a minimum wage is also important. Shouldn't we put a minimum wage in the Constitution? And then, of course, women's reproductive rights are important as well. So why shouldn't we put them in the Constitution? And so on and so on and so on. You get down the line where you have a constitution which has totally cannibalized your politics, and becomes sort of, as Natalie, I think, said, the mirror image of your politics. And so it's not so much a question about for me, about whether we should have a minimum wage, but where the kind of discussion about that should be transacted. There is, though, a relationship between the substance of a constitution, so in this case, a right to minimum wage, and also its amendment process. So, for example, I'd feel much more relaxed, or moderately more relaxed, about something like a minimum wage being in there if the constitution was relatively easily amended. The Irish constitution gives you a good example of a constitution that's difficult to amend. You have to have a national referendum if you amend the Irish constitution. In other countries, you have things like qualified majority in parliament to amend the basic law. That might change our interpretation of whether it was a good or a bad thing to have these rights in there. So there's a complicated relationship. I just want to say one other thing about America. Much of our ideas that fundamental rights reviewed in courts are a good thing derives from this American experience. The idea that litigation by interested people can be a real driver of social change. One of the best examples of that, which is often cited in America, is Brown against the Board of Education, in which the US Supreme Court ordered that schools be desegregated. But there are really interesting empirical studies, and very controversial, I should say, empirical studies, looking at the extent to which courts can really drive social change using these fundamental rights ideas. And actually, the picture is much more ambivalent than the ideologues of judicial review, and in this case, human rights review, I suppose, in Britain, really generally recognise that the real driver for civil integration in America, which is still a problematic thing, but it was legislative action. So I think I'd want to say in our little Scottish parallels to say that if we want to have minimum rights to a decent wage, if we want to have free education for people going to university, we have to fight for that politically and maintain that politically, and do so through political action, not through mannered access to highfalutin courts, which, let's remember, only a few people will be able to afford, whereas everybody can afford, to some extent, to get involved in democratic politics. So that'd be one of the arguments, I suppose, the broad arguments in that field.
Well, that's me told. So let's move on to our last topic of the day. Are you all wearing your poppies?
I'm not actually. I'm wearing nothing. I always broadcast these podcasts totally naked. Actually, that's not true. I am not wearing a poppy. I'm inside with a wee dog.
What do you think about this issue of wearing the poppy? And if someone from BBC news readers to sports stars, politicians, everyone, if they're not seen to be wearing it, there's now a kind of public witch hunt almost. How do you feel about this whole kerfuffle, Natalie?
It makes me deeply, deeply uncomfortable, actually, because I suppose the very principle I have about us going to war, and it should never be an easy or a light decision, and it should be agonised for, is to protect freedom and rights of people. And one of those is freedom of expression. And I feel that freedom of expression has been eroded in some kind of mass outpouring of adulation, I suppose. Not a glorying of war per se, but certainly a kind of acceptance that all previous conflicts that we've been involved in have been somehow praiseworthy or heroic. And it's not me trying to denigrate the armed forces or the people that are in them, but I do feel very uncomfortable that any kind of sentiment that you have about previous wars should be erased and and wiped out for some kind of public spectacle. But furthermore, and this is maybe even more controversial, I do see this kind of charitable giving to armed forces. It allows the government to abdicate their responsibility, I suppose, because I think that the fundamental position should be that governments who send troops to war should be responsible for the mental health, for the physical care of people who are damaged by war that they're sent to by a government. And so I do think that in many ways it allows the government to join in, looking as if they're in solidarity with forces as they piggyback off the work done by third sector and charitable organisations, when in actual fact they should be funding the services that these charities are working so hard to do so. And I think it lets the government off the hook.
And Stu, how do you feel about the poppy debate?
Well, I'm not wearing a poppy. I have a long personal history with the poppy. It goes back 20 years, and I think was the trigger for my first ever death threats. I got myself doorstepped by, let's call it, a down market tabloid newspaper over a controversy with the poppy a couple of decades back, and got actual genuine letters, really actually in green ink, from psychopathic nutcases demanding that I be immediately killed as a result. Which is obviously now is a daily occurrence, mostly from you and McComb, but at the time it was quite a startling thing. I wrote a piece on Wings this morning about this. I am really, really unsettled by the kind of horrible showbiz that now surrounds the poppy, the festival of remembrance with the carefully stage managed Cilla Black surprise reunion of the girl with her dad who was out in the Indian Ocean defending us against the terrible threats to Britain that are lurking in the Indian Ocean, apparently.
What, the fish?
I assume so, yeah. Or I just saw Captain Phillips at the cinema last week. I assume there's a couple of Somalian guys with sticks. I don't know exactly what we're afraid of in the Indian Ocean. But yeah, it makes me really uncomfortable. Purely by coincidence, I found myself in town yesterday with a clicker in my pocket. I wasn't just pleased to see people; it just happened that way. And it suddenly struck me as I was walking back from the post office. I'm going to see how many people are in town, see how many people are wearing a poppy. And I clicked 610 adults, of whom 37 were wearing poppies. Really, that's 6-7%, something like that. And I tweeted about it later. Several people said, "Oh yeah, I give money whenever I see the hate fund appeals, but I don't wear the poppy because I don't like what it's become." And it seems to be quite a widespread feeling now that people really don't like the sort of patriotic, jingoistic thing that the poppy is now an emblem of. When you've got 50,000 people holding up cards at Ibrox to make a poppy, and then our brave boys come along and dance along to No Surrender while waving Keep Ulster Protestant scarves. I think a lot of people are quite unhappy about that and don't really feel that that's what the poppy was supposed to be about.
Yeah. My problem with it kind of comes from what you're saying there. So you see in the street that not, as a percentage, not particularly a lot of people are wearing it, but the state broadcasters, the television, the media, the politicians being browbeaten into something by the state and the media is always slightly worrying, whether it's this or another issue. The fact that they're trying so hard to browbeat people into it is cause for concern in itself. But Andrew, what are your thoughts on the whole debate?
Yeah, there's a few things. I mean, one of my friends actually recently was stopped in the street in Oxford for not wearing a poppy by a woman, which seemed to me a remarkable thing. Certainly when I was growing up in sort of secondary school in particular, quite a conservative secondary school, that we got the full whack in terms of Remembrance Day services, that everybody was wearing poppies on their blazers, that there was a last post sounded and a specific actually I always found it quite emotional, that the remembrance ceremony, and I suspect like many people I tend to think about it via the spectrum of my own family's experience, to be honest. And my grandfather, I had two grandfathers, one of whom was slightly too young to fight in the Second War, but my father's father was, and he was in North Africa and Burma.